a pop culture icon, and a benchmark for the growth of an entire generation of viewers. The bond between Woody and Andy became a symbol of everyone's connection to their own childhood. A parallel journey where each installment reflects the painful yet necessary transitions of life. When Toy Story 3 was released in 2010, it reached the pinnacle of artistry and emotion. The film concluded with a sense of completeness that was almost painful. Andy hands his dearest friends over to Bonnie, officially closing the chapter of childhood to head off to college. It was a perfect farewell, a complete ending that few franchises in cinematic history have ever achieved. Director Quentin Tarantino even called it one of the best films he had ever seen, insisting he would never watch the fourth installment because the third ended the story in the most perfect way possible. However, commercial greed led Pixar to take a move no one expected, reviving the story that had already ended with Toy Story 4. From the very first frames, the film felt like a forced effort to milk profits from a brand that had already reached perfection, rather than honoring the legacy its predecessors worked so hard to build. The fourth film did not hesitate to shatter all the values, character development, and core elements of the series. The film forces the audience to ask whether a fourth part was truly necessary, or if this was just a cash grab by the Mouse House, lacking any understanding of what made this franchise so special. To understand why Toy Story 4 failed to uphold the legacy of the previous three films, we must first look back at the monumental stature of the ending in the third film. In Toy Story 3, the central message was the acceptance of change. The moment the toys hold hands facing the incinerator is one of the most intense scenes in animation history, symbolizing unity until the very last second. But it is the final scene where Andy gives his toys to Bonnie that truly defines the value of this trilogy. Andy introduced each of his friends to Bonnie with the utmost respect, especially Woody. He said, Bonnie then looked at Woody with longing and love, creating an implicit promise to Andy that Woody would continue his noble mission in a new home. However, Toy Story 4 pulled off a bitter reversal. Within less than a year of receiving the toys from Andy, Bonnie is depicted as having completely lost interest in Woody. She left him to gather dust and even stripped him of his sheriff's badge to give to Jessie. This change in Bonnie is not only forced but also hypocritical compared to what audiences saw in the previous film. If Andy knew that his most prized toy, the friend he intended to take to college, would be discarded so quickly and easily, he would surely have taken them back immediately. Turning Bonnie into a child who loses interest so easily diminishes the emotional value of the 2010 handoff, making Andy's noble act a wasted mistake. Throughout the first three films, Woody's core value was unconditional loyalty to his child. Whether being replaced by Buzz in the first film or facing the prospect of being sent to a museum in the second, Woody always chose to stay with Andy. Even when not played with for years before the third film began, Woody still steadfastly defended Andy against the doubts of other toys. Woody evolved from a selfish, jealous toy into a father figure and a leader who knows how to sacrifice and accept reality. Yet, in the fourth film, Woody seems to time travel, pulled back into the extreme anxiety of the first movie, but for a much more ridiculous reason. The film tries to convince the audience that Woody feels devastated and useless just because he is no longer a child's favorite toy. This is a serious decline in the character's integrity. It is an insult to a character who patiently waited for Andy for years in a dusty chest in the third film without ever losing faith in his purpose. Woody's sudden obsession with protecting Forky isn't about love for Bonnie, but a desperate attempt to validate his own worth and prove his relevance. Woody in the fourth film is no longer a guardian. He has become a senile old man clinging to the past, constantly mentioning Andy as if he were the only friend he ever had. Even though he is surrounded by a toy family that has been through life and death with him, the film forcing Woody into an identity crisis over such a trivial reason, especially compared to what he endured in the third film, is an insult to his previous journey of growth. The end of Toy Story 3 affirmed a heartwarming promise. Even as Andy grew up, the toys would still have each other, forming a family together at Bonnie's house. The classic line, "To infinity and beyond," was not just about adventures, but a pledge of eternal companionship between Woody and Buzz. Toy Story 4 shattered that vow. Woody's decision to leave Buzz, Jessie, and all the friends who stood by him through life and death to follow Bo Peep, someone he hadn't seen in 9 years, is a blatant betrayal of every lesson on loyalty he ever taught others. The film paints this decision as a pursuit of freedom, but in reality, it is a selfish and irresponsible act of a toy abandoning his child and his family just because of a bruised ego. It completely contradicts the very words Woody once spoke to Lotso in the third film. It renders the ending of the third film meaningless. The tears shed by the audience in 2010 have now been turned into a joke, because the new beginning at Bonnie's house felt like nothing more than a cold and temporary stopover. And what about Buzz Lightyear? For the Space Ranger, everything was far more painful and much worse. Buzz was one of the smartest characters in the series, a brilliant strategist who led the rescue team for Woody in the second film and planned the escape from Sunnyside in the third with extraordinary insight. Yet in the fourth film, Buzz was turned into a foolish and pathetic character. The movie uses the concept of an inner voice as a recurring joke to strip away his ability to think independently. It is completely absurd that a character who has known he is a toy since the first movie would mistake the concept of conscience for pre-recorded buttons on his chest. The height of the betrayal is the scene where Buzz abandons his mission at the antique store just because a button told him to go home. A true Buzz Lightyear would never abandon his companion. Pixar actually sacrificed the greatest friendship in cinematic history for a few cheap laughs from the audience. Toy Story 4 doesn't just ruin characters, it completely upends the philosophical foundation that formed the soul of this franchise. The mission of a toy is to be there and bring happiness to a child. And that mission was shattered by a character, namely Bo Peep. The return of Bo Peep was unrealistic in itself. In previous films, Bo was a gentle, calm character and a source of emotional support for Woody. But right from the opening scene of the fourth film, the movie deliberately tries to brainwash the audience by portraying Bo as a fierce action leader since the days of Andy. This directly contradicts the reality that she was originally a fragile porcelain figurine attached to a lamp, unable to move flexibly. Turning Bo Peep into an action heroine wasn't for character development, but to create a foil to belittle Woody, making him seem weak and foolish in front of her. The way Bo Peep treats Woody in the film bears no nuance of love, but rather condescension, degradation, and emotional abuse. She views him as an accessory, mocks his loyalty, and forces him to accept her worldview, which is one that worships the lifestyle of the lost. Throughout the first three films, being a lost toy was always depicted as a tragedy. It was Woody's greatest fear and the source of Jesse's deep pain. However, the fourth film normalizes, and even celebrates, this nomadic lifestyle as a form of liberation. Bo Peep is built up as the leader of a rebel faction, enticing other toys to abandon their herd and their child. This philosophy betrays the classic line, "Life is only worth living when you are loved by a child." Woody becoming a lost toy at the end of the film is not a spiritual awakening, but a selfish act of avoiding responsibility by a toy who decided to abandon his child just because his ego was bruised. The film intentionally paints the life of a lost toy as grand, but in reality, it is just an empty, aimless existence where they must wander parks waiting for temporary play and risking their lives pointlessly. What is the consequence? Woody's entire journey from the first to the third film, from learning to share love to accepting the passing of the torch, is completely erased. The ending of Toy Story 4 tells children that if you don't feel like the center of attention, just throw away your family and your promises to chase your personal desires. That is not the Pixar we once loved. It is the collapse of a moral value system that was once considered the standard in animated films. If the first three films spent time building a consistent and strict set of rules for the toy world, Toy Story 4 shattered that foundation with just a plastic fork from the trash. The appearance of Forky is not just a comedic plot point. It is an event that upends the entire definition of life in this universe. Bonnie glues plastic eyes, uses pipe cleaners for arms, and popsicle sticks for feet on a sport, and suddenly, it has consciousness. The question here is, what are the limits of life? If any inanimate object labeled as a toy by a child gains a soul, this world is essentially a horror nightmare. Would a backpack, a glue stick, or even a rock by the roadside wake up if Bonnie wrote her name on it? Pixar has betrayed its own rules. Previously, toys gained life when manufactured in a factory, like Buzz or the toys at Al's Toy Barn. Turning a child's imagination into a godlike power to create life leads to unsolvable contradictions. Turning this world into a place where ordinary objects are trapped in a cold existence means the consistency that makes a fantasy story convincing has completely shattered. Furthermore, Forky's existential crisis is handled in an extremely superficial way. The character constantly wants to end it all by jumping into the trash, a serious subject that should have been handled with subtlety and maturity. Instead, Pixar turned it into a recurring joke set to upbeat music, and after just one short speech from Woody, Forky immediately accepts his new identity. Compared to the painful journey Buzz went through to accept being a toy in the first movie, Forky's change is just lazy writing. Gabby. Gabby was introduced as a terrifying villain with an army of creepy ventriloquist dolls, manipulating and coercing Woody. However, the way the film redeems this character at the end feels rather forced and relies heavily on luck. The absurdity lies with Gabby. Gabby never truly shows remorse or takes responsibility for her cruel actions. She simply manipulates Woody's emotions to achieve her goal of taking his voice box. The peak of this misalignment is the message the film conveys through this character. That a toy, or a person, must be perfect to be worthy of love. This directly betrays the lesson from the second film, where Woody was still loved by Andy despite having a torn arm. In Toy Story 4, Gabby only finds a new owner after stealing a part from Woody. This sets a dangerous precedent for young viewers. If you have a flaw, you will never be good enough. Unless you change your appearance at any cost, even by harming others. Gabby's redemption doesn't come from a change of character but from a series of lucky screenwriter setups. Looking back at the entire journey of Toy Story 4, we must admit the bitter truth that this is not a necessary chapter of Pixar's legacy, but a product driven by commercial greed. Don't get me wrong, guys, if it stood alone as an independent film, Toy Story 4 is by no means a bad movie. But when placed into a franchise that has already built a clear ideology, completed character arcs, and achieved a fulfilling ending, it feels completely off. Toy Story 4 is a classic case of not knowing when to stop while at the top. Pixar chose to milk a flawless brand for revenue, and the price paid is the complete destruction of its core values. With Toy Story 5 about to be released,